So far, so good. I got a lot of calls this week. Many of you called me from Nashville, North Carolina, somebody from California, and asking about this. One call really stood out. He and I, we embraced in the lobby a few minutes ago. He called from Dallas. He's an American Airlines pilot. And he said, I'll be up for the day. Of course, you know, they can go wherever they want, whenever they want. And he said, I don't miss an Edgar Mitchell talk. I'm an Ed Mitchell groupie. And I said, well, do you think ALPA, American Association of Airline Pilots or something like that, would be interested in this? And he said, well, they should be, but frankly, pilots in general are very conservative, and the business is still pretty patriarchal, and it doesn't really fit with Edgar Mitchell's ideas. He said, but as a pilot, I can tell you, Ed Mitchell had not only courage to be a Navy test pilot and to go into a place that no one had ever been, space, to the moon, but he had a heck of a lot of courage to come out and to say the things that he did in that kind of environment. A lot. He said, you have no idea. So, get to know Ed Mitchell. Come to the reception afterward. Join Noetic Science. Join us. Join behind this man's incredible gifts and philosophy. If you get to know Edgar Mitchell, you really know someone in high places.
I want to build upon what James said to you a bit earlier. Let's go back 50 years. I'll tell you my story. 50 years ago, I was a young naval officer in the Korean War, at the end of the Korean War. And doing my job on a carrier, 1950s. And I'd like for you to remember, those of us who might have been around at that time, that essentially we lived in a three-layer universe. So that was the conventional wisdom. God in the heavens, man in the middle, and everything else below. And we really didn't know what was out there. Okay, we had some telescopes. The astronomers have been gazing at the heavens since Galileo's times, but only in our time did the power of those telescopes in the last century start to become strong enough that we were really starting to look deep into the heavens. And only in the 1920s did Hubble come up with the idea that the universe was expanding in the way it seems to be expanding. Let's put it very briefly. 50 years ago, we were even dumber than we are now as far as knowledge and exploration and understanding of where we are and what we are. And at the beginning of the space age, which occurred in October of '57, as I said, I was a young Navy pilot, aboard a carrier, headed back for shore duty and test pilot duty. I was a test pilot at that point, or beginning to be one. And suddenly the Soviets shot Sputnik into the atmosphere, into the heavens. And I said, that sounds like that might be an interesting thing to do. Certainly humans will be right behind robots. And it turned out that was true. And I set my goal at that point to be one of those. Now that was quite a departure for me because I had not ever planned on, even on a military career, and certainly not an aviation career, and certainly not going to the moon. I grew up in Texas and New Mexico, born in West Texas, grew up in New Mexico. and was the son of cattle ranchers, farmers. And although I did start to learn to fly when I was 13 years of age by washing airplanes to earn flight time. So I was a pilot in the early 40s, 1943, but planned a business career until the Korean War came along and changed my plans, and the Selective Service and the Draft Board changed my plans about going into business. And the rest is kind of history. But in those days, again, we lived in a three-layered universe. God in the heavens, man in the middle, and everything else below, and we really didn't know what was in the heavens. And Fred Hoyle, at that point, a great British astronomer that we just lost here a few years ago, pointed out at the beginning of the space age that if we ever get pictures of Earth from space, life will never be the same again. And he was right. The pictures we started bringing back in 1968 with Apollo 8, beginning to bring back the pictures of Earth, and every flight took pictures of Earth from deep space, and you saw some in the little clip that you saw earlier, are the most published pictures in the history of the world. There hasn't been a day since the late 60s and early 70s since we've had those pictures of space, of Earth from space, that somewhere in the world, in every city, in their print or their electronic media, there hasn't been one of those pictures showing in the broadcast or print day. Why? Because they speak to us at a very deep, deep level and help us ask the question, who are we and how did we get here and where are we going? They go to us at a very deep level of reality. And that's been going on now for over 30 years, 35 years almost. And so we're accustomed to thinking and seeing ourselves through those pictures from deep space. Let me build upon those ideas just a little bit. And let me remind you that when I went to the moon in 1971, when we started the Apollo program, it was still a conventional wisdom that we're alone in the universe. We're it. No one thinks that way anymore, at least those that have studied the issue a little bit, and the astronomers that have slowly been convinced by looking at solar systems and planets in solar systems and starting to look at the conditions for life. We're starting to come reasonably to the conclusion that life probably evolved in the universe everywhere that our environmental conditions have permitted. And likely, that is millions and perhaps billions of planets in around billions of solar systems. And we even see millions and millions of galaxies. In other words, now, as different from the 50 years ago, when we first started going into space, we're starting to get an understanding, thanks to the Hubble telescope and thanks to modern technology, of the immensity of this universe that we live in, that we couldn't hardly even dream of when I made the decision to go into space 50 years ago. Wow. Things do change, don't they? I feel very privileged to be a part of that team of men and women that created the Apollo program. It was daring of John Kennedy to announce the program in 1963 of going to the moon. And of course, it was a political decision. It wasn't a science decision. And a decision out of time, actually. I did my doctoral work at MIT in the early 60s in preparation, hopefully, that they couldn't not select me. So after I made that decision in 1957 that I wanted to go into space, I set about I was a test pilot. I set about to get more education, get more training. I was too young when the initial group of astronauts were selected in 1958. Too young, too inexperienced. I was only 27 years old at that time and only had a few thousand hours of jet experience, and it took a lot more than that. So I set out to get additional education and did, courtesy of government, and got my PhD from MIT, and finally persuaded them through being insistent and applying every time there was an astronaut selected. I was selected in 1966 to be a part of the Apollo program. And at that time was the only astronaut with both a doctor's degree from a prestigious engineering college and test pilot credentials. And that stood me well because it has allowed me to understand things and be involved in things, even in the astronaut program, that I might not have been able to be involved in otherwise. Also, how many have seen the Apollo 13 movie? Well, I can't see your hands out there, but presumably a lot of you, yes. Well, my career path at that point was I helped build the lunar module. I chose to be a part of the team to build the lunar module at Grumman Bethpage in Long Island, and helped get the first lunar module on Apollo 9. Then I moved to Apollo 10 as a backup crewman on Apollo 10, which was a dress rehearsal for the lunar landing. And then, as procedure would have it, we were to move to Apollo 13. But Gordon Cooper, who I worked with as backup crew as Apollo 10, retired from the program at that point, and Alan Shepard came on and was assigned to Apollo 13. And so we were the original Apollo 13 crew. Except headquarters said, Alan, you have been grounded. He had an inner ear problem, some of you may realize, an inner ear problem, and was grounded for a number of years. And when he finally got that resolved and was back on flight status, headquarters said, you haven't been training, so we better take some more training, take a little more time to train your crew. And so over our protest, headquarters switched us with Jim Lovell's crew on then Apollo 14. And we took 14, they took 13. They got the bad bird, we got a good bird, as fate would have it. Anyhow, just to continue that story a little bit, I happened to be in mission control when the Apollo 13 system blew, and immediately headed to the lunar module simulator because we knew that we would have to convert the lunar module to a lifeboat or tugboat to get them home. Ken Mattingly, whom you, if you saw the movie, may recall, he was originally the Apollo 13 command module pilot, but he got bumped from the flight because he had been exposed to the measles from Charlie Duke's children, who was the backup there. And so he got bumped, and his backup took his place. And so Ken Mattingly and I were the two most senior lunar module pilot and command module pilot, respectively, available. And we spent the next 4 days in the simulators working the problems that they would have to solve in space, or we had to solve before they could get home. And you saw that in the Apollo 13 movie. I ended up on the cutting room floor. And to which Tom Hanks and Ron Howard apologized profusely, but that's Hollywood, you see. The whole point was that this exciting, wonderful program that we were a part of, to explore the depth and to get beyond this planet Earth and start our exploration. We had our moments of terror, we had our moments of triumph, we had heartache, heartbreak, we lost men from the Apollo 1 fire, of course, and we had near misses with the Apollo 13 crew. But we did what we did. And it was wonderful. Privilege, honor, and just pure fun to be a part of that team to set foot on another planet for the first time. Wow. You saw a picture of me bouncing down off of the lunar module ladder. We landed so softly it didn't compress the strut, so it made a hard jump to get down to the surface from the lunar module, and an even harder jump to get back up when we got back up in the spacecraft. But, wow, it was the height of an explorer's dream to go where humans have never been, to explore another planet, to bring back the stories from that expedition and be able to share it with you folks here. And particularly to be able to share it 30-some years later. But as pointed out in the little video clip on noetics, that wasn't, for me, the vital part of that mission. What really happened on the way home after the work on the surface had been done, and let me set the stage for you a little bit to tell you that story. We were flying home perpendicular to the plane in which the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun existed, and rotating, we called it the barbecue mode, to keep thermal balance on the spacecraft as we rotated in the sunlight. But what happened as a result of that, as we moved that way but rotated this way, every 2 minutes, the panorama of the Earth, the Moon, the Sun, the heavens, moved through the cabin window. And I will point out to you that without the Earth's intervening atmosphere, the heavens, the galaxies, the galactic clusters, the Milky Way are 10 times as bright, meaning 10 times as many stars, as you can see on the clearest night from a mountaintop here on Earth. Wow, it is overwhelmingly magnificent. And to see that panorama come through the window every 2 minutes during our rotation was a wow experience. Being a lunar module pilot, most of my work was completed since my responsibility was the lunar surface activities, the lunar spacecraft, and since we left that behind in lunar orbit, crashed it on the surface, had done our work, my job primarily was that of a systems engineer on a well-functioning spacecraft on the way home. Alan and Stuart, my teammates, had a little more work to do. I had to work too, but by and large, they had responsibilities, and most of my responsibilities had been completed. So I could be the tourist looking out the window at this magnificent panorama that we were viewing. And as was reported, I had this experience of looking at the heavens and seeing all this glory in its separateness, but experiencing viscerally this interconnectedness, the fact that there's something different here. It's a bliss, it's a mountaintop, it's a peak to experience, to see it like that, but experience it here and feel the connectedness. Jump ahead just a little bit. I came home after watching this every time I look out the window for 3 days on the way home and started looking into the literature. What is this? What causes one to have this type of experience? And if there was nothing in the scientific literature to explain it, so I went to the mystical literature and discovered in the ancient Sanskrit, thanks to scholars that I have appealed to help me with my search, and found in the Sanskrit the description called Salvakapa Samadhi, which means to see things in their separateness, but to experience them internally in their unity, with an ecstasy and a bliss that goes with it. Wow. Intriguing, intriguing, intriguing. A life-changing, unforgettable type of experience. Not being satisfied with that, I continued to dig through the literature and discovered that a description similar to that was contained in the history, the mythology, the legends of virtually every culture in the world from ancient times. Somewhere was this transcendent experience a part of the culture. Wow. What then became apparent that even though that transcendent experience was described in every culture of the world in some way, the explanation and the meaning attached to it was a cultural explanation, a cultural meaning. And whereas the experience seemed to be the same, the explanation seemed to be different. Let's call the transcendent experience the esoteric. Let's call the explanation and the meaning attached to it the exoteric. The exoteric in modern days we call religion. The esoteric is what happened. And we fight over whose explanation and whose God is the better one. But it's rooted in virtually the same experience of perceiving a deeper reality about ourselves and our place in the universe than you do in a normal state of consciousness. While I was still in space and thinking about this and having this experience, I realized that every culture in our history has asked the question from time immemorial and looked into the heavens and looked at each other and looked at the world around and said, who am I? Where did I come from? Where is this going? What's this all about? In other words, we seek that place for ourselves with each other, but what are we in this universe itself, in this larger scheme of things? And I realized that our story, as told by our scientific description at that time and still today, is incomplete and possibly flawed. And the story of ourselves, as told by these various cultural traditions, were archaic and very likely flawed as well. And that as a spacefaring civilization now, having stepped outside our planet and begun the exploration of deep space, that we probably needed to re-ask the question again. Who are we? How do we get here? And where are we going? Because our explanations didn't seem adequate to what I was looking at. And it seemed that if I considered science on one hand and our cultural religious traditions on the other, that the area of disagreement of what this was all about centered on why are we conscious at all? Because science had not at that time, and even just barely today, has addressed itself to what is the nature of consciousness. Why are we conscious? What is consciousness? How does it fit in the scheme of things? And as I came back to Earth with those questions burning in my mind, and this image of the magnificence of the panorama and the heavens burning in my mind also, I realized that this wasn't going to turn loose of me, this feeling, this thought, this need was not going to turn loose until I did something about it. And since at that point, by the time I flew Apollo 14, it had already been decided in Washington, in the halls of Congress, that the public wasn't going to go finance many more missions to the moon. And that Apollos 18, 19, and 20 had been canceled. I was supposed to, or it was rumored I was supposed to be the commander of Apollo 19. And the last 3 flights were canceled because the public had said, ho-hum, been there, done that, what have you done for me today? So we did not continue the exploration into the moon, to the lunar surface. and getting the science that the scientist really wanted to get. I chose not to at that point, since I would not be flying until sometime in the shuttle program, 10 to 12 years later. I chose not to fly a desk for 10 years. And this burning question of what is this really all about inspired me to start seeking help to get an institute started where we could examine these questions, ergo the beginning of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I will say that I thought we would solve some of these problems that we're still working with. I thought we would solve them in fairly short order if we applied the tools of modern science. How naive can we get? I will admit that we're still wrestling with the deeper ones right now, and we have made an enormous amount of progress, I know. But the basic issues that we face in answering what is consciousness and how did it arise and how did it come to be and where are we going with it and what can we do with it are still not fully answered. And of course, the most fundamental questions about consciousness that remain: does consciousness survive our death? I was asked this question by one of my early board members. Were we going to research the question of does consciousness survive death? And 30 years ago, my reply was, and it happened to be to a dear friend at that point and a very important man by the name of John Fetzer, who founded the Fetzer Foundation. And I said, John, I would be glad to research the survival of consciousness after death if I knew what consciousness was. But until I know what it is, how in the world can I tell you if it survives? And we still don't have a good definition in science as to whether consciousness requires matter of the mind-brain to be in existence, or whether it is possible, as the earlier philosophies would suggest, that consciousness exists apart from physical matter. And in the earlier philosophies, and certainly all the religious traditions, if there is a deity, then consciousness must exist without matter. And those deep and burning questions certainly are on the forefront of what we would like to know, and we still don't know. So we have to content ourselves by being more slow, moving more carefully and cautiously than we would like, perhaps, because the answers are very hard to come by. And it turns out that we in science are pretty slow to change our minds about things, even when the evidence is in front of us. Now, part of the thing I did not mention, but I should mention at this point, and some of you already know, I did some parapsychological experiments, ESP experiments, on the Apollo 14 flight. Kind of did it at the last minute with some friends, that a couple of medical doctors that were interested, because they were interested in these types of issues also. So we concocted this type of experiment, that the same as J.B. Rhine had done in the laboratory 30 years before, and had been doing for 30 years, and getting positive results. And we wanted to know, could you do the same thing in space? And would you get positive results? And the answer was yes. We did it, we got results, it worked. Just about the same, with the same statistical probabilities and evidence that they would got in the laboratory. So space and the distance to the moon didn't make any difference. And yet, even with that, science was not about to accept, was not about to accept at that point, that this was a valid area of scientific research. It's taken years to bring it into reality. And that was because we didn't have a theory within classical physics that would permit such functioning to take place. And only as quantum science, and James touched upon this a bit, only as quantum science has evolved over the last 70 years, 80 years, almost 80 years now, as quantum science has evolved, have we started to make the connection and have it started to be accepted in science that maybe quantum science can tell us something about the way consciousness operates and about the way mind-body operates at a very deep level, beneath the level of chemical modeling. Now, you're quite well aware, I know, of not only the power of the drug companies in creating new remedies, chemical remedies for us, but the power of the drug companies in keeping us from doing anything else but using chemical model to understand our physical well-being. And we have, over the last 35 or so years, starting with Becker, Robert Becker, up at the University of Syracuse, or rather at a hospital in Syracuse, New York, began doing gathering evidence on the electrical aspects of the body and the role of healing in electrical models. But we haven't really progressed with that because science simply wasn't going to buy into it at that point. And the ideas of remote healing and distance healing and faith healing and psychic healing that we have seen around for a long, long time weren't being accepted either. Well, we have, as James pointed out, we have helped pioneer in these areas. And I will describe to you in a short time. I not only have helped study this type of remote healing, I've had it practiced on me. And here, later in life, I have experienced that personally and will tell you about that today too. So we have had 30 years of helping break down the barriers to move into new paradigms and to hopefully change science and our thinking in the process. But I like to quote from Max Planck, the great physicist of the late 19th, early 20th century, who helped start quantum physics. And Max Planck said, progress isn't made by convincing skeptics, but funeral by funeral. And that is the type of problem that we have encountered as we have wrestled with these frontier notions. But let me build on a part here that looks like it opens the door to very, very powerful new paradigms, powerful new approaches and tell you a little bit about it. And James used a few of the words that are very vital here. Entanglement is certainly one of them. Non-locality is another one. Coherence is another one. And resonance is another one. I ask you to remember and think about those four words: entanglement, coherence, non-locality, and resonance. And we're going to talk about them just a little bit to help cement this idea, because those are the predominant characteristics of quantum mechanics and quantum physics that are different from what you learned in high school about Newton and classical Newtonian physics. And those aspects are very germane to what we're talking about. We mentioned parapsychological phenomena and psychic stuff and J.B. Rhine. And those notions have been denied or were denied by mainstream science, and in many cases still are. But it has been demonstrated over and over and over. And in all the literature, and certainly our own colleague, Dean Radin out at the Institute, has written papers on it and books on it. and the evidence is simply overwhelming, that virtually all of the psychic events, and let's call it intuitive events, because intuition is the basis for really all of this. It's a deep information transfer at the psychic intuitive level. And they're all non-local. They're all non-local. What does that mean? That means they can't be screened by electromagnetic shielding. You can put Faraday cages, you can put shielded rooms, and you can not shield this type of information. The only other thing in nature that is true about, that we know for certain, is the phenomenon of gravitation. We can't shield gravitation. Planetary gravitation is going to influence things regardless of what you shield it. There is no way. And we have always suspected, you see, that gravitation is a quantum phenomenon too, but no one has ever found the mediating particle, because it's such a subtle thing, has not found it at the level of the quantum. It is what keeps us, as you may have heard, what keeps us from unifying general relativity from Einstein and quantum mechanics into a single unified theory, is the fact that we can't get gravitation into it at the moment. And gravitation is non-local. So are all of these fundamental psychic events that we talk about. Well, what in the world does that mean? What are we talking about here? This is powerful stuff. Let me describe very, very briefly, if I may, what we're talking about. Entanglement, as the physicists would talk about it, says that if two particles are ever in a process together at subatomic level, and they are separated and go across the universe from each other, they maintain a correlation. It's called quantum correlation. And if you do something with one, the other one will instantaneously know about it. Quantum correlation. That's entanglement. And it has been validated. It was proposed in the early days of quantum mechanics in the 1920s. It was not fully demonstrated until 1982 with an series of experiments in Paris called the aspect experiments by a physicist there and his team that demonstrated decisively that non-locality and this entanglement across the universe was real. The problem was, you see, Einstein said it couldn't happen. This is spooky action at a distance, because information would have to travel faster than the speed of light. Sorry, Dr. Einstein, that's the way it is. Now, we still haven't come to grips with the fact that that information is usable, because standard dogma says not only is quantum information not usable because of this non-locality, but furthermore, it's not recoverable. And simply it has been ignored. And the next dogma is that doesn't have anything to do with our scale size, our macro scale. It only has to do with the tiny scale of subatomic matter. And we have lived with these fallacies now for almost 80 years. They're wrong. They're just dead wrong. Because we're now starting to understand that this biomatter that makes us up and makes us all living substance, we have said, and chemistry has validated, that the primary constituents of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen that make up our molecular biomatter is not any really different than the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen that you'll find out in inanimate nature, except it's quantum entangled. And this has not been acknowledged, recognized, or even utilized for the 75 to 80 years that quantum mechanics has been in process. We're just now coming to grips with this. Now, do we all know the answers? Heavens no. As James pointed out, we're just getting started on understanding this direction in science and what it really means. Just beginning to. But it was very clear to us 30 years ago that this was likely the direction we had to go if we were going to understand consciousness, if we were going to understand healing at the level, alternative medical integrative approaches, that we now use those words. If we were going to understand that, we had to be doing it through this mechanism of quantum entanglement and quantum mechanics. Let me help cement a few ideas for you here before we go on with it. I use the word resonance. Resonance at the quantum level is very similar to resonance that you've seen quite often. If you pluck a violin string over here, a similarly tuned violin string across the room or however far away, it's not too far away, will vibrate. Resonance at the quantum level says it's even if it's entangled and it's across the universe, it will vibrate and resonate with each other. But also, if we're going to get the information back, we will be in resonance. And this quality of resonance is when we are entangled with each other mentally, psychically, consciously. And a perfect example of that is the twin phenomenon, and I'm sure you've heard of it, that twins seem to have an empathy, that they can be around the world from each other and on any given day might wear exactly the same color of clothes or be doing similar things because they have an entanglement from the womb that is generally greater than other people. But we do find our entanglements and our resonances with our mates, our loved ones. We have a certain amount of entanglement and resonance with them continuously. And you get to the point where you're completing each other's, with your spouse, your mate, you complete each other's sentences at times and think the same thoughts. You know what I'm talking about here. Those are a type of entanglement phenomena. Now we use the word coherence. What does coherence mean? The best example, or a quick example, is coherent light, laser light. And what that means is the waveforms are all in line with each other. Polarized light is coherent light. But normal sunlight coming from the sun, and these lights coming down here, shining on me, are not coherent. Their waveforms are every which way. There's a lot more power in coherent light. And when these entanglements take place, they become coherent. Well, that is exactly what is happening in our biomatter. When that makes it fluid, that makes, is probably what makes acupuncture systems work. We're starting to understand the subtle energies that we're talking about, and they're related to this coherence. They're related to a level of functioning that we haven't adequately described in science at all, and we're just getting around to doing that. And it's showing us things about energy, things about coherence, things about resonance that we take for granted because that's the way we operate. But if we're going to explain it within science, we are just now starting to get the clues as to how to do it. Now, I mentioned to you earlier, a bit earlier, that I had had experience with remote healing, distance healing. And I'm going to tell you a little story from the early days as to how I got interested in this because of my mother. Shortly after coming back from the moon, I was doing a speaking engagement in Little Rock, Arkansas. And it was a conference put on by a fellow by the name of Harold Sherman, a very early pioneer in psychic events. And at that meeting, at that conference, was a Tibetan healer by the name of Norbu Chen. And I didn't know much about healing. I'd heard about faith healing. You know, I was raised in a Baptist church here in the South. I didn't know much about faith healing except I'd heard about it. I certainly didn't know its variations. And being a scientist, I was pretty skeptical about such things. But my mother came to visit me at this conference in Little Rock, had driven over from Tahlequah, Oklahoma, to visit me. We hadn't seen each other since the flight in over a year, about almost a year, I guess. And she came over to see me, and Mother had glaucoma, and she had thick Coke bottle glasses, and was rapidly getting worse. And in those days, doing something with glaucoma it was very, what little was known, weren't very successful, and she wasn't willing to risk any of that, whatever they could do. So watching this healer operate, not knowing whether he was really a charlatan or not, my devious little mind got to operating, and I said, well, if he's any good and Mama has a need, let's see if we can get them together. And Mother, being a good sport, and Norbu being a willing demonstrator, said yes. So I got them together in my room one evening and asked him to do his thing. And he did went through his mantra, his meditation, passed his hand over her head for a short while, and said, Mrs. Mitchell, go to your room, treat yourself as though you've had major surgery, have a little grape juice and broth for this evening, and let's see what happens. The next morning at 6 o'clock, my mother came rushing into my room with her Bible in one hand, her glasses in the other. Praise the Lord, son, I can see, I can see. I was sound asleep, came out of my sleep. Oh, what, Mama? Okay, yeah, you can see? Wonderful. Yes, son, praise the Lord, I can see, and proceeded to read out of her Bible to prove it to me. Then proceeded to drop her glasses on the floor and grind them under her heel. Praise the Lord, I can see. Yes, Mama, that's wonderful. Well, Mother then drove 200 miles back home, sans glasses, legally blind, and everything seemed to be fine. What was I to do? I couldn't figure out what to do except to invite Norbu Chin to come live with me. I wanted to figure out what was going on. Which he did later on. But that isn't quite the end of the story. I talked to my mother every day for the next week. Mama, how are you? Is everything okay? Yes, son, I'm fine, my eyes are fine. Wonderful, Mama. That went on for a week. And one day Mother called me. And as soon as I heard her voice, son, I knew something was up. Yes, Mama, what's the matter? Son, is Norbu a Christian? I didn't want to respond. Son, is Norbu a Christian? No, Mama, he's Buddhist, but he's a very good man. Oh, I've been healed by Satan. The next day, my mother had to get her glasses back, her thick Coke bottle glasses. She rejected the healing. However, she passed away 10 years later. Clearly, she was a very bright woman. Belief system. Zane was talking, belief system. By the time she passed away, less than 10 years later, her eyesight had improved to 20/40. Now, her glaucoma didn't come back, but she had refused to see because of her belief. But as the year passed by, she came to grips with the mind phenomena that had taken place. She had blocked her healing, but then when she realized what she was doing, she was able to say, well, if I undid the healing, maybe I can do it back again. Now, I don't really know what went on in her mind. She didn't tell me, but I do know that by the time she passed away a few years later, her prescription for her glasses were 20/40, and they had been 20/200 at the time of this incident. Healing? Yes. Belief system? Yes. The power of our intentionality, the power of our understanding. In 1971, just a few days before our 9/11 event, by the way, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer by my urologist. And I'd been alerted to that in my annual physical exam. I didn't feel anything. I wasn't sick or anything like that. But the urologist said, well, your PSA is high. Let's take a biopsy. We did that. They said, yeah, there's cancer cells there. I would like to operate next week. I said, thank you, doctor, but no thank you. I think I'd like to think about this. I did. And I went on a detox program, which helped me feel better, think better, clearly. It was improving things. But then we had a meeting a couple of months later in early 1972 at Petaluma at the Institute board meeting. And my board of directors knew that I had this problem. And the president at that time, Winston Franklin, who just preceded James, and whom we lost this last August, came to me and said, Edgar, we know you have a problem. The board would like to have a healing ceremony for you. May we? And I said, of course, I'll take all the help I can get. Well, fortunately, some of our number of our board, circle members, close supporters, had been to the Nine Gates Mystery School and were steeped in shamanistic traditions and understood Eastern traditions in healing and were very confident of their ability. And, you know, these types of meditation and thinking procedures create coherence in the brain, where it's not as quiet and where it's not as noisy and staticky like most of it is when we aren't trained in that way. So they held a healing ceremony that night after the board meeting, and I want to describe that to you. I, having watched it now over the years, for 30 years, in many, many circumstances, and seen it happen to others, but here it was happening to me. And I lay down on a pad, and my friends, my board members, about 50 people in the room, came forward in groups of 7 or 8, 9, whomever could get around, hands on for a few seconds, and while all the time chanting the Om chant, that is familiar from Eastern tradition. And as one group would step back, another group would step forward, and this went on for about 20 minutes. And some scientists in the room, who were our friends and colleagues, said that they felt the energy level of the room start to rise and rise and rise during this event. And I went into meditation myself. I was meditating to help. And I felt like waves of the ocean gently lapping on the shore, waving, coming over my body and receding, coming over my body and receding. And I'll have to admit, very shortly I was totally spaced out. I mean, I was floating and being grounded. You know what being grounded is? No, I wasn't grounded. I had to go back to Florida. I went back to Florida. This was on a Saturday night. By Thursday the next week, I felt I was grounded again. I was coherent. I was in my body. I was feeling normal. I immediately called and made an appointment in New York to have an examination and with an eminent physician radiologist there with a high-definition Doppler sonogram. Went to New York, took my records with me, went to New York. We compared records. He did his examination. He said, "You're clear. There's no cancer." This was 1 week later. We monitored it for the next 2 years. Still no cancer. It works. How does it work? Intentionality is a part of it. Love, resonance, coherence, caring are all a part of it. We do that for each other. We can do that for each other. Non-locality. The mystics have said forever that there's a mystical, surprising, misunderstood, not understood connection in the universe that connects us all. Now, in quantum physics, we call this coherence, entanglement, and non-locality. The mystics have been talking about it for thousands of years. Now, we in modern science are starting to come to grips with it. But it is a part and parcel of this healing phenomenon. Intentionality, love, compassion, all of these values, all of these emotional attributes that we all have deep within us when we can get past our ego, when we can get past our greed, when we can get past those emotions and feelings and thoughts that are not worthy of thinking. We get past those and get coherent, we can make these things work. The whole purpose that we had in mind when we established the Institute of Noetic Sciences was to help create a sustainable civilization of which understanding knowledge, understanding ourselves, and helping create an entirely new approach to the ancient question of who are we, how did we get here, and where is this going? That's been our goal, and all of this is a part of it. It's a big picture, it's a big order. Sustainable civilization, James touched upon it. We're certainly in trouble. How do you characterize that? Take a look at the 20th century. Take a look at all of history, but particularly the 20th century. And look at the impact and the change. Any measure of human activity you choose, I don't care what it is, from population growth to the number of VCRs, the new inventions, the new improved boxes of washing machine cleaner, whatever. How many new automobiles do we need? Every measure of human activity is on an exponential growth curve. An exponential growth curve like that. And at the beginning of the 20th century, it turned sharply upward. It doesn't take mathematical genius to understand that exponential growth cannot continue indefinitely in a finite space. And we have a finite space on this planet we call Earth. And we are creating situations and circumstances, and we don't need to go into it too deeply because we all already know what they are. Our population is growing so that if we all were to consume at the level that we consume here in the United States and in the Western world, we would very shortly be in deep, deep problem. Our species are becoming extinct. Our neighbors, the animal species, many of our plant species, the rainforest are all endangered. The garbage is building up exponentially. How long can we live this way? And we are seeing, I don't know how connected it is to these phenomena, but I hear from the television just today, we were calling it the blizzard of '05 is the greatest in hundreds of years in the northeast part of the United States. But the whole issue, as James pointed out, and as others have said, if not us, who? If not now, when are we going to confront these issues and deal with them? We had a saying invented by one of our people in the Institute, and I think it came from perhaps Chief Seattle originally. We're the ones we've been waiting for. Let's hope that's true. Let's hope that's true. We have an enormous task ahead of us, and without us lending ourselves to that task, we are in danger. Our civilization is in danger. And if we don't start on it right away, it may be too late. Now, I don't want to continue to talk. I think I have introduced enough ideas to you here. We have some time left. I would like to open the floor to us. We have a couple of microphones on either side, and carry this forward with dialogue with you, because the most important thing I think I can do is to try to understand your points of view and where you are and what your questions are, and see if we can move forward with that and in the time remaining. But I would like to end my formal remarks here, and then we can bring up the lights and go into a Q&A a little bit. I'd like to end my formal remarks with a statement that came out of the ancient Sanskrit that I have used for many years. It was brought to my attention by an anthropologist, a dear, dear lady, now passed away, but a great anthropologist of years ago, Catherine Breese Whiting, the wife of a Navy admiral whom I knew. And she found it in the Sanskrit and passed it on to me. And it seems very apropos to exactly what we're discovering today in modern times. And it goes, God sleeps in the minerals, awakens in plants, walks in the animals, and thinks in man. Thank you very much. Thank you. You're very kind.